everybody. Thank you for coming to explore this topic of the Schillinger or Schillinger house. As you know, his name was pronounced in different ways over the years. So why am I trying to tell you this story about Schillinger and Berklee? First of all, I want to share with you one idea, and I think this idea adds to the understanding of who Schillinger was and what he did. And the idea is that some of the methods that popular musicians use today actually can be traced back to the avant-garde. And Schillinger was the person who made them popular. So when the Berklee College opened in 1945, as you know, it was first called the Schillinger House. And in this great photo, we can see the founder of Schillinger House, Berklee College of Music, Lawrence Berk, teaching with a book in his hands. And this book is a copy of a book published after Schillinger's death of his theories. It's called the Schillinger System. So why did Lawrence Berk initially call his music school the Schillinger House? One obvious reason is, of course, that many of the methods that were taught here came from that direction. But there are also other reasons. And I think one important reason is that the name itself at that time kind of stood for success in the music business. His pupils, Schillinger pupils, were numerous about the arrangers who worked for radio stations. And having a recommendation from him could give you the job at that time, as it did for many people. Over the years, the Berklee College and its founder, Lawrence Berk, went from relying very heavily on Schillinger methods in the 1940s to almost not mentioning his name at all in the 1960s. And to trace this history, I went to the Berklee archives and found very interesting early materials about the history. For example, I went through the Berklee archive, and several paid checks from the 1930s caught my attention. It turned out these checks were Lawrence Berk's payments to Schillinger for private music lessons in New York. One lesson cost $10 at that time. And if you translate it into today's money, it's about $184 for each lesson. And the young Lawrence Berk was paying for 4 lessons in advance, so it was a lot of time for the young man at that time. So when he later came to Boston and began teaching, first privately, the Schillinger methods, they were really the mainstay of his program. And in fact, early methods of creating music, composing music, were called pre-Schillinger. So I think that's a very bold way of stating the influence in music. And there were efforts to attract students when the Schillinger House formed, and there were radio transmissions to do that. And some of the transmissions from the 1940s have miraculously, I would say, survived. And in the archive in the Berklee archive, and I did listen to them in the archive, and some of the things that the radio host said in the 1940s to attract students were, for example, Schillinger was the genius who discovered a way of adapting mathematical principles to music. simplifying the process of arranging and giving the arranger unlimited ideas. So in the early years, it was mostly about crafting ideas for arrangement. Then the radio host visited the Schillinger house and told the expression that the students got into the music, and the harmonies were truly amazing. And as Lawrence Berg explained it to us, it was due to the fact that they have begun to absorb something of this famous system of Schillingers. Or the host also said, the Schillinger system, you see, is the modern name of magic in music. It's a revolutionary approach, a difficult word at that time, to instrument and arranging through scientific mathematical principles, and it's the only 100% Schillinger course of instruction in America. So there were actually other schools also at that time that did teach the method. But all the principal words like scientific, mathematical, all even revolutionary and even genius, they all come from Schillinger himself. So he didn't hesitate to make it clear. As the teaching program evolved over the years, Schillinger became less and less of a priority here at Berklee. One of the documents I found in the archives shows that by the early 60s, he was barely ever mentioned in official documents or in official descriptions. Yet I would say that the seeds of mathematical thinking were sown in American popular music. And they continue to grow, especially now that so much in music production is based on computation. So who was this Joseph Schillinger, and how could he gain such power? He was a Russian-American musician and theorist. He is best known for his use of mathematics in music and for teaching some very famous American musicians. Among his pupils were George Gershwin, the band leaders Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and others, and also Lawrence Berg, the founder of Berklee. Schillinger himself went as a young man through the Russian School of Classical Music, and he was actually teaching classical music in Russia before coming to the United States. And when he was still a young man, the Russian monarchy crumbled and the new Soviet state was installed in 1917. And this has radically changed the Russian culture of that time. For some years, actually for 10 years, the avant-garde was supported by the state. Unlike in later decades of Soviet culture where it wasn't supported, it was supported during the initial years of the Soviet state. And this was the time when Schillinger became what I would call a mathematical avant-gardist. So what do I mean by that? He believed in the power of mathematics to give new and better tools for composition. Like all the avant-garde people around him at that time, he believed that traditional music harmony, as well as intuitive, spontaneous composition, is primitive and ineffective. He advertised, when he was teaching himself, advertised his method of composition as being an especially quick way of creating music. So if at that time in New York you work as a radio arranger in the 1930s, you sometimes need to create arrangements or variations of music very quickly. And of course you can do it intuitively, but for Schillinger it would be a very backwards way of doing that. So instead, he tried to encourage his pupils to create music through some kind of novel, experimental, mathematics-inspired methods, even if the music ended up being not very traditional. And like many other Soviet musicians of his generation, he firmly believed that avant-garde can be popular. So here are some examples for the creation of music through mathematical means. I'll start with a simple one. I found it in the archive when I was working at doing research at the Library of Congress and the New York Public Library. So when Schillinger came to the United States, he began teaching George Gershwin. And he showed Gershwin the following formal way of creating variations. Multiplication. Multiplication, the basic principle being that you count the intervals and you multiply them. And you do that for each and every note in the melody and also in the accompaniment, virtually changing the chord structure, the harmonies. So here in this example, just trying to show very quickly that if you take this interval and if you multiply it by 2 or by 3, you end up with a different interval. Now in Gershwin's notebook, when Gershwin takes lessons from Schillinger in the 1930s, this is how it looks in Gershwin's notebook. Here's the first line is the starting melody. You see it's fairly tonal, centered on C major, you could say, but then you multiply it, the intervals by 2, by 3, and so on. So it goes on until 7. I'm just showing you the first 3 ones. And just to give you an impression of how this sounds, I have here a short video. So basically you have first a very traditional melody based in tonality, and then when you start to multiply the intervals, you very quickly abandon the traditional scales and you eliminate any existing links between the melody and any sort of classical harmony. One funny thing actually is that Gershwin did that before Schillinger taught him to do that. So, and the way it works is that Schillinger says it himself in his writing that he takes works of famous composers, tries to extract features and composition methods from them, and then he can teach them back to them, because maybe at the time when Gershwin did that, he didn't really understand what he's doing. Now he's understanding. And in fact, Schillinger saw this multiplication as a way to modernize music of the past. I think it was a very clever idea. If you multiply the intervals by 2, the smallest interval you will end up will be 2 semitones, and you will automatically end up with a whole tone scale. So you end up with a piece based on a whole tone scale. And if you multiply by 3, you'll end up with a diminished 7th chord as the basis of the whole piece. And he argued that by doing that, you don't have to think, you don't have to be creative. You just do the math, and you can take some sort of old music that nobody needs, like Bach, and by doing the multiplication, you automatically transport it into the 20th century. So his idea was that if you know his methods, which included not just this one, but many, many others, you can quickly turn a small musical idea or an existing classical piece into a ton of musical material. And it was his firm belief that by using mathematics, you would end up with better music than all the music of the previous centuries. By the way, Gershwin or Schillinger made a mistake here, and the notebook contains a C instead of an A, which I have corrected. And I think that's interesting, because on the one hand you think you're so mathematical and you're so exact, and then you make a mistake. But what do you do? Do you use it in your piece as it is? I think that's really interesting, and shows some of the difficulties in applying mathematical methods, especially when they are new. Of course, if you learn them as a child, you will not make such mistakes anymore. And Schillinger made many such mistakes throughout his writing. They're full of them. And I think for me it's a kind of a commentary on really the boundaries of human cognition. Also, if you implement these methods in a computer program, you will not have the errors anymore unless you made a mistake in programming, right? So now let's return to the Schillinger house itself. So the Schillinger house did not always remain the Schillinger house, as we all know. At some point it was renamed, removing the reference to Schillinger. Some methods were still taught until the 1960s, but they gradually became less and less well known here and elsewhere. But there is a living, very successful musician who studied at the Schillinger house and for whom we have the proof that he learned the methods. And you'll know this musician. His name is Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones came to the Schillinger house in 1951. So what we have at the moment, I hope I can find more, but what we have at the moment is a page from his notebook where he shows that he understands a method of Schillinger method of orchestration. Here's the page. The page is actually taken from a book. The book is called Berkeley, the First 50 Years. The first thing you see is, of course, Quincy Jones' beautiful handwriting. And you see his name in the upper corner. But what this method does is it helps you distribute a repeating rhythmic motive across a number of instruments. I've transcribed the lower part of it. So you have a repeating rhythmic motive consisting of dotted quarter note, and 3 eighth notes. And the task that he fulfills here is to write out the motive in such a way that each note will be played by a different instrument or instrument group, and the repetition will stop when the motive has reached its end, the bar has reached its end, and the instruments have all played in a given order. So it's an exercise in overlaying repeating patterns of different length. 3 instruments against 5 notes, and the length of the motive, which is 8 notes, against the length of the bar, which is 6. All of this has to be synchronized. And note also that everything is happening in 6/8 time, so the listener will also have to kind of synchronize everything. To make it more clear, an overlay of a pattern which is 8 elements long against 6. the actual method of computation behind Quincy Jones' own example is really quite involved, and we can discuss it after the talk, and if you want, you can take a look at the example in the book. It's described there in his own handwriting. But what you really only need today is a mathematics website. So there are mathematics websites you can use, and the only thing you really need here is the least common multiple. It will tell you, the least common multiple will tell you how long it will take until the repeating patterns will end up simultaneously at the end. So if you take a mathematics website and use the formula LCM of 6 and 8, it will give you 24 8 notes, and 24 8 notes, 4 bars in 6/8 time. That's all you need for this. Such a method of overlaying patterns is a mainstay of Schillinger technique. He always began his instruction by teaching it. When Lawrence Berg went to study with Schillinger, he also learned it. Here's a page from Berg's notebook from the Berkeley archive. In the lower part, this thing here is showing graphically the overlay of patterns of different length. That's the very first page in the very first notebook. It always starts with this. So why did Schillinger do that? You can argue that these methods not always work, and why did he do that? I would say that like some other composers of that time also, he tried to attack the automatism with which traditional rhythm, harmony, melody are just coming up in intuitive composition. Still, the question was, will the people like it? After all, the goal of all this in the United States was mostly to teach people who will create popular and commercial music. And here comes an interesting twist, that like many other people in the early Soviet avant-garde, Schillinger was convinced that modernist music will be more popular than the European classical tradition. The idea was basically that how people lived, how people worked, was so different, has changed so radically since the 19th century that old music just would not fit anymore. So he did not see any contradiction between modernist, anti-traditional music and popularity. And some of his pupils' creations did become very popular. I'll give you just one short example at the end. The Moonlight Serenade by his pupil Glenn Miller. Moonlight Serenade was very popular and still is. There is still at the moment a lot of disagreement whether Moonlight Serenade really was created as homework for Schillinger or not. Schillinger claimed, as he always did, that the tune was just an exercise he gave to Glenn Miller. But Glenn Miller's own notebooks have also survived from that time, and they have been preserved, and the Glenn Miller archive in Boulder provided me with some copies. And these copies show that there is indeed an exercise which is, I would say, somewhat similar to the Moonlight Serenade. However, it in no way contains all the elements that make the Moonlight Serenade recognizable and, I would say, popular. So the exercise itself goes like this. The 6-note motive in the first bar without the harmony is, I think, what Schillinger gave to Glenn Miller. And then Glenn Miller went on to add harmony to it and to create variations of the motive, making the E into an E flat to fit the harmony, and so on. So in this exercise, Glenn Miller does arrive at this sequence of C minor and C diminished with the repeating motive of C, D, E flat, and the triple rhythm, which are all also in the actual piece. But the actual piece is actually much more complex and long. It has a developed harmony. It has many other sides to it, like a special kind of orchestration, which also made the piece stand out at the time. So I would say the clear answer to the question whether Moonlight Serenade was just Glenn Miller's homework is yes and no. Now to sum up. This place, the Berklee College of Music, has been originally founded as the Schillinger House. Joseph Schillinger was a Russian avant-garde composer and theorist who was inspired by mathematics and who taught famous American musicians such as George Gershwin, Glenn Miller, and the founder of Berklee, Lawrence Berk. And this has created a curious and, I would say, unexpected line of influence that goes from the early Soviet avant-garde to the American popular music. And the most curious thing about it, for me, is the underlying belief that to be popular, you don't have to follow tradition. Thank you. And please ask any questions. I'll try to answer them now. I don't know who was first. Please, please. Yes, surviving examples of his compositions from Soviet Union, yes. They have survived. They've been published. At that time, he actually hasn't really arrived at all the mathematical methods, but he started working in this direction pretty early. But he only gradually became so mathematical like he was in his later years. Thank you for the question. So how this works. You have to set a starting node from which you will calculate the intervals for your piece. And it kind of makes sense that if this is kind of in C major, you would start from C. From C to C, you have 0 semitones, so it will stay the same. From C to D, you have 2 semitones, and multiplying it by 2, you will arrive at E. And you do that for each and every note, and even if there's a chord. So Schillinger actually took a piece by Bach and a fugue, and he multiplied all the intervals in it, and he actually wrote the whole thing out in his own writing. I found it in the archive. So yes, he was very fond of this method. Were there any other questions? I'm sorry, I may have not seen any. Thank you. Yeah. So whether people have been using it recently, I actually haven't studied modern use of it yet. I plan to do that. I know that there are people who teach the method. And if people are teaching, somebody is going to use that. And previously, long after Schillinger's death, there were composers of avant-garde music, actually, who did use that. But I haven't studied it yet. I was just studying the period when he was still living. I think you would get a better answer to that if you ask people from Berkeley, not me, and I'm not. But I honestly don't know yet. But I think that's a very interesting question. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, thank you. So how this is connected to acoustics of sound and upper harmonics, right? He tries to work in this way and to write in his book that all of this only works because it is so connected to the physics of sound. I'm not sure it is, but it still works as a means of creating music. It does, but to actually really conclusively make this follow from the physics of the vibrating air, I think is very, very difficult. But he does try to connect somewhat to physics. It was the approach actually that was very popular at Soviet research institutions, where he learned about all this in the early 1920s. The people did refer back to acoustics, to Hermann von Helmholtz's research in 19th century Germany to start their own research program in Soviet Russia. So he did pick it up, but it does not really follow from that. Thank you for the question. Yeah. That's my favorite. The serial composers, basically, there is so much pushback against any notion of Schillinger having anything to do with that. Because, he's the one who's teaching the people, creating commercial music. How can he ever have anything to do with the high art of serial music? But to me, it is similar. Yeah. So I think there are connections to him and to other people as well. But yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. So this actually is kind of a long story, and the basic part of it is that Schillinger died unexpectedly at a relatively young age before this started. So he died in 43 unexpectedly, and Berklee College was founded in 45. So he, but I would say the language is what really has survived. How Schillinger was describing himself, how he was trying to advertise his own teaching, has really made an impact on how the early Schillinger House was advertised. So there's a real connection in language, as you have seen in the radio broadcast. This comes directly from Schillinger, the language. But yeah, the changing trajectory of Berklee is a different research project. I didn't do that yet. Thank you. Yes, thank you for your question. I'm afraid I cannot answer it yet. There are lists of different lists of people who studied with him that have been pulled together from various sources. And after this talk, I can take a brief look at the list if I can find the name there. But right now, I can't answer it yet. Sorry. Mm. Yeah. Thank you. I think that would be a fascinating topic to explore more. And yeah, maybe somebody from the audience can, after the talk, share some insights with me. I would be very grateful to learn about it. Yes. If you multiply by 2, that's it. Um, uh, I'm not sure I understand.
So he's kind of just narrowed down options.
Yeah. By narrowing down options and by systematically excluding things, you create a new coherence in your musical material.
So is this sort of
Sure.
an invitation to just
No. So the example in the Gershwin notebook, it went until 7. And you can also multiply, as he does here, by 3 or by 5. If you multiply by 6, you will end up with a piece only consisting of this one interval. You can have a piece that only consists of minor thirds, or a scale, actually based on a scale which consists only of minor thirds. You can do all that, and if you start combining this with all the other methods, you will end up with a different kind of mathematical coherence. Maybe you will end up with chaos, but yeah. Yes. So the short answer is yes, because also at the Russian research institutions in the 1920s, it was a very popular theme. Many people did that. And he also did that when he came to New York. He created his system he called double equal temperament, which is basically around each of the 12 notes you have extra small steps. To add, you create a microtonal scale. So yes, that was kind of a standard thing for the people like him at that time.
Maybe one final question. I know it's about 10:00, so probably to get to it.
Yes. 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 Yes, it's kind of unusual, right? But yes, but Earl Brown is a good example. There are publications on that already, so I didn't go into that too deeply. I was looking for some way to add to the existing scholarship, and I think what I can add is this focus on the influence coming from the Russian 1920s. That's, I think, a new thing I'm adding to it. But there are, of course, also other researchers that do research on that.
Would you join me in thanking Nikita?
Thank you.